The time has come for my people to go.
I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's what the people demand, and we gonna keep fighting till we get that land. I'm not a queen, I'm a servant of the people. I'm not a king, I'm a servant of the people. It's time to rise, to get what we want, we got to organize.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good comrades, good people. Wherever you are in the world, you have me again, Jamilah. It is I, and I am an organizer with the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, of which we are presenting this podcast to you, the Pantsula Podcast. It is episode 77, so thank you for sticking with us in this experience. The objective, of course, of the A-APRP is United Africa under scientific socialism. If you have any questions about what that means for us, what that means for the world, you can contact us, as well as go to our website, aaprp-intl.org. And of course, it is crucial before we move into any of our episodes that we honor our ancestors, because it is them who laid the groundwork for what we do. As we say, without them, there is no us. On this episode, we are honoring our jamilah, as well as Antonio Agostinho da Silva Neto. Based in Venezuela, jamilah was a strong, active voice organizing against imperialist and patriarchal forces and influences. In her schooling years, she was the founder of the Center for Student Novelists, which challenged gender inequities in education. In 1946, she co-founded and served as a secretary to the National Union of Women organization, or the Organización de la Unión Nacional de Mujeres. She also organized with the Women's Committee of the Patriotic Board, or the Comité Femenino de la Junta Patriótica, and the Legion of Women Nationalists, the Legión de Mujeres Nacionalistas. She was vice president of the First Congress of Venezuelan Women and fought guerrilla style against opposing forces as part of the Communist Party of Venezuela. In later years, she served on the Women's Advisory Commission to the Presidency of the Republic. She also was an advisor to the Transcultural Institute of Studies of Black Women. She was one of the founders of Movement to Socialism, or MAS, M-A-S, where in 1990 she became party president. Much of her work involved organizing against educational, workplace, economic, and reproductive inequities. Quite crucial to today's episode, she organized for maternity leave, child care centers, the right to have a child out of wedlock, as well as for the safety and of the decriminalization of abortions. Antonio Agostinho da Silva Neto was a leader in the MPLA, or the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola. He was the first president of Angola from 1975 to 1979. Sort of in line with the theme of today's show, that Democrats and Republicans hold the same imperialist interest, the U.S. refused NATO's request for assistance against the Portuguese forces because of oil interest. Because of this, the U.S. chose to support the anti-communist opposition party, the National Liberation Front of Angola, or the FNLA. As a physician and highly regarded poet, Neto physically departed from this earth in September of 1979 in the midst of treatment for cancer in the USSR. Ashe. If you haven't seen the title of this episode, we are talking about Fourth of the Lie. And of course, that's of particular interest due to a lot of things going on. It seems like a light bulb is finally coming to a head, if you will, or starting to undim itself. A lot of people are saying, oh, the cloak is coming off. But the thing is, the cloak has already been off. The question is whether or not we've been paying attention to that cloak already being off. The foundation of this country has been extremely clear since day one. So, of course, if you haven't heard, People have been out in the streets protesting the so-called Supreme Court's decision on overturning Roe versus Wade. We need to set the stage for both the history of the so-called Supreme Court as well as the foundation of this country, hence, Fourth of the Lie. People stay surprised at the decisions the three branches of government consistently make. However, a keen study of history, some political education, if you will quickly take off the veils. This country has no interest in serving anyone but those who are part of the capitalist class. Patriarchy, white supremacy, ableism, and all of these things people look at singularly are enabled by the system of capitalism. So let's take a look at the short history of the so-called Supreme Court, shall we? We have the Dred Scott decision in 1856. The court ruled against a man who was petitioning for his freedom. They maintained that the Bill of Rights did not apply to African people. There was the Hirabayashi versus U.S. case, where Gordon Hirabayashi challenged Executive Order 9066, the internment camps and Japanese exclusion laws signed off by Franklin D. Roosevelt. The so-called Supreme Court upheld the executive order. There's a renewed interest in the 1967 Loving v. Virginia case, as it's being deemed threatened as a result of this current decision. However, in 1883, there was a similar case regarding interracial marriages with Pace v. Alabama. I'm sure you know how that decision went. There's also Plessy versus Ferguson, the decision in 1896 that upheld segregation of public institutions. Prior to Plessy versus Ferguson, there was another decision in 1883 made by the so-called Supreme Court, in which the judges struck down the original 1875 version of the Civil Rights Act. If you need some current examples, here we go. Here's a couple of pieces I want to read. One is from the ACLU's website. It's talking about the most racist Supreme Court cases you've probably never heard of. So it says, over 100 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a series of rulings known as the Insular cases that still prevent millions of people, overwhelmingly people of color, from accessing certain constitutional rights and protections. These rulings continue to uphold systemic racism today. In the Insular cases, the Supreme Court spoke to whether and to what extent the rights and protections guaranteed by the Constitution applied to residents in the then new territories of Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. In the string of cases decided from 1901 to 1922, the court described the territory's inhabitants as, quote, alien races and savage tribes, end quote. The court based its views squarely on the presumed racial inferiority of the non-white people who live there. In doing so, the Supreme Court showed obvious contempt for the predominantly Asian, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Pacific Islander residents of these territories. The Insular cases are unabashedly racist, firmly rooted in white supremacy, and still haunt the day-to-day lives of millions of people. This is why today, this is again coming from the ACLU, along with a coalition of civil rights groups, sent a letter to the Biden administration urging them to condemn these cases and stop relying on the precedent they set in present or future cases. As usually understood, these decisions held that constitutional provisions and safeguards do not automatically apply to people living in these territories. The rationale for that view was explicitly race-based. In the leading Insular case, Down versus Bidwell, the court considered whether the phrase United States, as used in specific constitutional provision, included Puerto Rico. Informed by disdain for Puerto Rico residents, the court said it did not. The opposite result, acknowledging the Constitution fully applied in Puerto Rico, was too alarming to consider. As one justice put it, doing so would, quote, inflict grave detriment to the United States, end quote, indicating that affirming constitutional rights applied to people in a predominantly BIPOC populated territory would be a threat to the broader country. Since the United States founding, there was a long-held presumption that the Constitution's protections would naturally apply in the nation's territories. The court broke away from this practice with the Insular cases to keep the new territories from enjoying full constitutional protections. When the U.S. acquired Florida in 1819, for example, few seriously questioned whether the Constitution applied there. Key differences between territories acquired before 1898 and those acquired later, particularly the people who lived there and their location, made all the difference to the court. The later acquired territories were, for the first time, populated mostly by people of color and so far from the U.S. mainland that they were unlikely to be settled by white people. To ensure the Constitution would not block U.S. expansion, the court made up a new doctrine, so-called territorial incorporation, that said some constitutional provisions and protections could be switched off on those islands and for those residents until Congress said otherwise. So there's that example. There's also from multiracialunity.org. This was written in 2020. The ACLU article was written in February of 2022. The Multiracial Unity article says, with the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the nomination by President Donald Trump of Amy Coney Barrett to immediately fill Ginsburg's position on the court, completing factions of the U.S. ruling have geared up for a furious battle over Trump's third appointment to that court. The Democrats threaten to retaliate against Trump's plan if they win the 2020 presidential election and retake the U.S. Senate by expanding the number of justices on the court and then packing it with liberal justices. Liberal and conservative media pundits, law professor, and political analysts have all staked out their positions. They are all promoting the idea that Trump's presumed success in jamming Barrett's nomination through the U.S. Senate will fundamentally change the U.S. political and legal landscape. But for whom? It is true that the U.S. Supreme Court is a political institution. The mythology spread among the population that the judicial system is able to deal out justice because they are above politics, and the class struggle is slowly beginning to lose its grip. The political nature of the courts and the injustice system has become more apparent in the wake of countless murders of Black and Latino workers by racist cops who go unpunished. Nevertheless, many workers who justifiably hate the open racism and fascism of the Trump administration still believe that appointing liberal justices to the Supreme Court can significantly change our lives. For the working class, this is a deadly illusion. First, how could the survival of any democracy hang on to the appointment of one person to one branch of the government when real power in the society lies with a ruling class of bankers and billionaires? More importantly, regardless of liberal or conservative sentiments, party affiliation, or loyalty to any particular president amongst the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, the institution itself has constantly ratified and enforced a racist, anti-working class system of laws. The immediate targets of these racist attacks range from freed Black slaves to laborers from Japan and China. But the divisive effect of these decisions has greatly aided the racist ruling class, while being a dagger through the heart of the working class unity. Even court decisions that have invalidated racial segregation or otherwise struck down discriminatory practices have frequently been undermined by a failure to enforce these decisions or by later decisions which weakened their scope. This article definitely called it. Let us begin with the 1823 decision, Johnson's and Graham's Lessee versus McIntosh, that established the principle that federal courts would not recognize the sale of lands by indigenous tribes of Native Americans. These sales were voided by the court based on the, quote, doctrine of discovery that gave European conquerors and their descendants absolute title to all indigenous lands. This principle was relied upon by no less than the celebrated former Justice Ginsburg herself to help rationalize a 2005 decision denying the indigenous Oneida Nation sovereignty over lands they had been forced to sell during the federal government's early murderous resettlement westward of New York and other tribes in the early 1800s. So there's your RBG. People are like, oh, RBG. The only RBG I recognize is red, black, and green. I'll tell you that much. So those are two more recent discussions about the racist history and present tense of the U.S. Supreme Court. I also want to make a connection with the Israeli Supreme Court because, as you know, Israel gets billions upon billions of dollars from U.S. tax dollars. So this has everything to do with you, whether or not you know it. So this is from towardfreedom.org. Massafar Yada, occupied West Bank, talks about the Israeli military started training in Masafar Yada, a rural, arid enclave south of the occupied West Bank city of Hebron. This comes after more than 2 decades of Palestinians using legal avenues to try to stop the seizure of their land. The military training has involved the army sticking shooting targets onto tractors, windows, and barrels of hay. Expected to last a whole month, this is the first such military training exercise in the Palestinian community in 20 years, and comes as Masafar Yatta is experiencing the largest mass expulsion of Palestinians since 1967. Demonstrations, regularly met with violence from soldiers and Israeli settlers, have occurred almost weekly since Israel's Supreme Court rejected a petition in May against the expulsion of more than 1,000 Palestinians. For example, on June 10th, the Israeli army attacked a Palestinian-led protest. Soldiers beat protesters, fired tear gas that burned demonstrators, threw stun grenades, and detained Israeli solidarity activists. More than 200 Palestinians, Israelis, and Jews from both the United States and the United Kingdom protested as part of the Save Masafar Yatta campaign. Quote, "Our protests show the racism and how the Israeli army treats us," said Basil Adja, an activist from the village of Tuwani in Masafar Yatta. Soldiers who claim that they are not allowed to stop settlers from committing violence against us are then very aggressive towards protesters, end quote. There's your Supreme Court in settler colonialist area of the world. Both the U.S. and Israel are settler colonial lands, and those lands should be returned to their rightful people. So on to the fourth of the lie. There's a lot of connections here. I want to address Martin Luther King Jr.'s July 4th, 1965 speech. It is a speech also painted by the myth that somehow the American dream, trademark, this so-called American democracy, upheld and promoted by so many, is, quote, one of the things that distinguishes our form of government with some of the other totalitarian systems, end quote. MLK, while aptly critiquing his country, still at this particular point believed communism, for example, was more of a direct threat to people's self-determination. He advocated for a social democracy, but not necessarily the outright ownership over the means of production by the masses. While he mentions at the beginning of the speech that this dream is aligned with amazing universalism, he also notes that it mentions how each individual has certain inherent rights that are neither derived from or conferred by the state. They are the gift from the hands of the Almighty God, end quote. This universalism that is idealized in the speech counters the very individualism the documents charting the foundation of this country espouse. You can't have a, quote, socio-political document expressed in such profound, eloquent, and unequivocal language, the dignity and the worth of human personality, end quote, when the very baseline of that document discounts the humanity of particular groups of people. At one point in the speech, he says, quote, "I would like to suggest some things that we must do in order to realize this great dream. First, we must begin with a world perspective, for we will not be able to realize the American dream until we work to realize a world dream for peace and brotherhood and goodwill," end quote. While this has a specific purpose, it is actually not unlike what El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, or Malcolm X, stated, and about fully not understanding what was happening to Africans in the United States if you didn't understand what was happening in the Congo. People are in the streets now due to the so-called Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade. However, the violence of sanctions imposed by the U.S. also affects reproductive care. The violence of police terrorism also removes life. Economic inequities inhibit people from receiving adequate health care in order to assure those who will be born can come into this world unharmed. Before I get into what El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz said, I want to talk about what Comrade Margaret Kimberly, who was on our last episode actually, what she talked about in an article called How Not to Celebrate Juneteenth. It says Juneteenth has become the latest iteration of liberal capture of black politics, opportunistic virtue signaling, and the international misrepresentation of America's history. Juneteenth was largely a regional holiday celebrated by Black people in Texas and other southern states. It commemorates the events of June 19th, 1865, when Union troops arrived in Galveston and announced that slavery ended as per General Order No. 3. Quote, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." End quote. It is an important event that ought to be remembered, but its true significance has been lost. Juneteenth has become the latest iteration of liberal capture of Black politics, opportunistic virtue signaling, and the intentional misrepresentation of America's history. Corrupt and avaricious corporations honor Juneteenth, and cynical politicians give it great attention. There are calls to make it an official federal holiday. Unfortunately, the most common narratives of the Civil War are fraught with lies meant to give dispensation to bad actors of that era and to sanitize awful truths. Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863, and is one of the most misunderstood documents in history. Lincoln was far from the great emancipator of the American imagination. In the early days of the war, he ordered that enslaved people who escaped to Union lines be returned to their slaveholders. His goal was to accommodate the Southern states as much as possible and keep them and their peculiar institution in the Union. Only rebel intransigence and the determination of the enslaved to be free changed his plans. Lincoln wanted to prevent slaveholding states Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri from seceding. That is why the proclamation freed only those people located in states that had already seceded, that is to say, under Confederate control, which made it practically meaningless as a tool of emancipation. The proclamation also exempted those areas of Confederacy which were already under Union control. He also insisted that the little emancipation that he offered be tied to colonization, the relocation of Black people outside of the country. It is rarely mentioned that he signed such a colonization plan on December 31st, 1862, the day before signing the Emancipation Proclamation. A group of 500 contrabands were sent to Ile Vache, a small island off the coast of Haiti, in 1863. They were ravaged by hunger and disease, and only 365 survived when they were rescued in 1865. This insistence on continuing this pro-Lincoln mythology has turned the Juneteenth story into a nonsensical fairy tale. We are told that enslaved people didn't know the war had ended and didn't know they should have been freed until the Union Army arrived in Texas. Of course, Texans of all races knew that Robert E. Lee surrendered his armies in April 1865, and they knew that Lincoln was assassinated shortly thereafter. They had newspapers and the telegraph and letters from those who left the battlefield. Enslaved people were aware of anything that white people knew. They overheard conversations and saw white soldiers returning home. Some were on the battlefield as laborers in the Confederate Army. The official announcement only confirmed what they already knew. The explanation of the late announcement is very simple. Texas is further west and was off the beaten path of the Union Army. It took them 2 months to establish their victory and send troops to Confederate hinterlands. It is also not surprising that the slaveholders wouldn't free anyone until they absolutely had to. There was no one able to enforce Lincoln's 2-year-old decree, and they simply went about business as usual, squeezing the last ounce of forced labor out of their human chattel while they had the chance. Juneteenth is an opportunity to tell the history of enslaved people who freed themselves when they could and joined the Army to form the United States Colored Troops, or the USCT. The untold importance of the Emancipation Proclamation, it is that established the rights of escaped people to join the Army. Frederick Douglass and others pleaded with Lincoln for 2 years to arm the people who had the greatest stake in the outcome of the war. Juneteenth is an opportunity to debunk and mystify. I'll also read a little bit from our comrade Ajamu Umi. It's time for us to reclaim Juneteenth. This is from Hood Communist. The links will be in the description if you are interested in reading all of these. The militancy of the Black Power movement and the overall emerging militancy of African and other colonized people signal the change in our enemy's approach. If you've been paying close attention to the tactics of the capitalist system over the last 25 years, you can see the trend. The mass movements of the past taught the capitalist system that their go-to reliance exclusively upon brutality and ironclad control is no longer a viable strategy. Make no mistake about it, of course, they still utilize brutality, and they always will, but they have made adjustments. They have learned the meaning of Kwame Ture's axiom that truth crushed to earth will rise 1,000 times. As a result, instead of relying solely on brute terrorism against the African masses, the capitalist system has begun to sprinkle in neoliberal tactics. This theme was introduced during the late 1960s when the African masses within the U.S. burned more than 300 cities in protest against this racist, backward society. National Guard, police, and mass media were helpless against this onslaught of righteous African rage. The capitalist class responded to this swiftly. The militancy of the Black Power movement and the overall emerging militancy of African and other colonized people signaled a change in our enemy's approach. Upon being elected president in 1968 on an anti-African platform, Richard Nixon joined forces with other bourgeoisie chess pieces like David Rockefeller, the patriarch of the Rockefeller capitalist ruling class family, and McGeorge Bundy, president of the Ford Foundation, to formulate the concept of affirmative action. This was fueled in part by their study of the Kerner Commission report, which predicted that unless the class cleavages within the society that powered institutional racism were addressed, the resulting social unrest could unravel in this country. The objective of their affirmative action plan was to broaden the African petite bourgeoisie class. Their thinking in doing this was that a larger African petite bourgeoisie would create a necessary buffer class that would serve the purpose of corralling the African masses, primarily by projecting a vision of opportunity and success within the capitalist system for any and all Africans who would come to embrace and believe in the American dream. Besides this increased admission of African college graduates, minority contract programs, and other elements of affirmative action, by the 1980s, the African petite bourgeoisie had expanded to the point where Africans, for the first time in the history of this country, had a significantly sized petite bourgeoisie. The role of this new class would be to create a new segment of African people who personally benefited from the capitalist system and therefore saw their role as being that buffer to protect the capitalist system. This led to a proliferation of African petite bourgeoisie politicians in elected offices who advanced policy changes like the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Along with them came an increase in African voices in Hollywood. Together, these people would begin franchising the production of ongoing African success stories that complemented the increased focus upon celebrity culture, while the nonprofit industrial complex quietly and quickly came to replace the mass culture of independent African organizations that were actually beholden to the interests of the African masses. It's within this environment that the co-option of African political and cultural institutions like Juneteenth has gradually taken place. The elevation of the African petite bourgeoisie has transformed the optics of the African freedom struggle from its correct standpoint of being a movement aimed at completely overturning the capitalist system that perpetuates our oppression to optics that define our struggle simply as our individual advancement within the capitalist system. This motto explains why Juneteenth, a holiday that represents African people breaking the chains of chattel slavery, can now be promoted as a vehicle of deception provided to us by the U.S. government. In 1938, C.L.R. James wrote the classic book, A History of Pan-African Revolt, which chronicled over 300 African slave revolts from Africa to the Middle Passage and throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. In it, you can see that there were many political, economic, and social reasons why chattel slavery was defeated in the Western Hemisphere, but none were more important than the constant pressure we placed upon this backward system from our constant resistance against it. As a means of preventing that kind of organized resistance from ever rising again, it became incredibly important to turn over that assignment of controlling the rage of our people to a class of African people whose primary interest is in protecting the capitalist system. This contradiction explains why multinational corporations, many of whom got their start from the investment of money acquired from the slave trade, can now co-sponsor Juneteenth commemorations. That's why we see the very same Wells Fargo and JP Morgan Chase Bank, who use money soaked in the blood of our African ancestors to build their financial empire, now attempting to convince you that they care about investing in our people. That's why police can be seen at Juneteenth commemorations all over this country, co-sponsoring, tabling, and recruiting our youth. The very same police who developed as an institution by serving as the violent slave catchers who terrorized our people into turning around and heading back into the oppressive plantation industries in the southern U.S. today. We are supposed to believe that same police force is now supposed to be at Juneteenth celebrating and serving our community. Apple can ruthlessly exploit African coltan in the Congo to finance the profitability of their electronics while honoring Juneteenth with their red, black, and green Apple Watches. Walmart will be selling Juneteenth red, black, and green ice cream while they continue to exploit everyone everywhere with the unprecedented low wages, oppressive work conditions, and the types of favorable relationships with municipalities that would make a street pimp blush. All of this is a reflection of the new strategy to fool us into believing that the institutions that have maintained themselves based upon exploiting Africa and African people are interested in respecting our culture and our experiences within this society. So with that, I do want to address this particular thing before I get into the El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz quote. So there is Sean Combs, aka Puffy, aka Diddy, whatever you call him. I don't know, whatever. Apparently, there was a BET Awards. I did not know that until I got a text from a friend. So, I don't know. Puffy, Sean Combs, Diddy, whatever you want to call him, he wins a Lifetime Achievement Award, or received a Lifetime Achievement Award. And he says, quote, "I got this dream of black people being free. I got this dream of us controlling our own destiny. I got this dream of us taking accountability and stop killing each other. I got this dream of us being rich and wealthy and living on the same block. I have this dream of us unifying." So Sean Combs, Puffy, Puff Diddy, P. Diddy, whatever you call him, he's evoking Martin Luther King. He's evoking a particular speech that, of course, gets consistently misappropriated, including by Sean Puffy Combs. Not only do people evoke this portion of the speech, but they miss what came beforehand when Martin Luther King was actually talking about a blank check. Martin Luther King was talking about, we want what's owed to us, before this I have a dream portion of that speech. So Sean Puffy Combs, P. Diddy, Puffy Diddy, whatever you call him, he sandwiches what I actually do agree with. I absolutely agree with Africans controlling our own destiny. I absolutely agree with Africans unifying. But what's in between that sandwich is that Sean Puffy Combs, P. Diddy, whatever you want to call him, his class interests are not our class interests. So when he talks about controlling our own destiny, he's talking about African people being part of the capitalist class. He's not talking about African people having the ownership of the means of production. He's not talking about socialism. He's not talking about unifying in a revolutionary sense. He's talking about being rich and wealthy and living on the same block. And then, instead of addressing how capitalism shapes this brutality upon African people by the state, he talks about accountability and we need to stop killing each other. So again, his class interests are not our class interests, because the very police who are trained by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are the police who kill African people. This was not addressed in his speech. It is our responsibility to stop killing each other instead of looking at the systems which prevent that self-determination that he has this dream about. So I just wanted to say that little thing because everything's connected. Here is the El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz quote, because this brings an even further connection to everything I've said previously. What he says is, quote, "The white liberal is the worst enemy to America and the worst enemy to the black man. Let me first explain what I mean by this white liberal. In America, there is no such thing as Democrats and Republicans anymore. That's antiquated. In America, you have liberals and conservatives. This is what the American political structure boils down to among whites. The only people who are living in the past and thinks in terms of I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican is the American Negro. He's the one who runs around bragging about party affiliation, and he's the one who sticks to the Democrat or sticks to the Republican. But white people in America are divided into two groups, liberals and Republicans, or rather, liberals and conservatives. And when you find white people vote in the political picture, they're not divided in terms of Democrats and Republicans. They're divided consistently as conservatives and as liberal. The Democrats who are conservative vote with Republicans who are conservative. Democrats who are liberals vote with Republicans who are liberals. You find this in Washington, D.C. Now, the white liberals aren't white people who are for independence, who are liberal, who are moral, who are ethical in their thinking. They are just a fraction of the white people who are jockeying for power, the same as the white conservatives are a fraction of white people who are jockeying for power. Now, they are fighting each other for booty, for power, for prestige, and the one who is the football in the game is a Negro. 20 million black people in this country are a political football, a political pawn in an economic football, an economic pawn, a social football, a social pawn. And before I get into, there's a lot of quotes, there's a lot of things today. I also want to get into a quote I saw, which is directly what he's talking about. So this was what an article, I think this was from Huffington Post, actually. But this is someone named Ben Smith. He lives in suburban Larimer County, Colorado, north of Denver. He said he reluctantly registered as a Republican early in the year after becoming increasingly concerned about the Democrats' support in some localities for mandatory COVID-19 vaccines, the party's inability to quell violent crime, and its frequent focus on racial justice. So that is very much in line with what Malcolm X was talking about. People do not vote in accordance to Democrat or Republican. They vote in line with liberal or conservative values. And in many cases, those things are very much aligned with each other. What Martin Luther King says further talks about a similar thing. He says, quote, "What we are witnessing today in so many northern communities is a sort of quasi-liberalism, which is based on the principle of looking sympathetically at all sides. It is a liberalism so bent on seeing all sides that it fails to become committed to either side." He also says, "I hear a lot of talk these days about our direct action, talk alienating former friends. I would rather feel they are bringing to the surface latent prejudices that are already there. If our direct action programs alienate our friends, then they were never really our friends." A leading voice in the chorus of social transition belongs to the white liberal. Over the last few years, many Negroes have felt their troublesome adversary was not the obvious bigot of the Ku Klux Klan or the John Birch Society, but the white liberal who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers tranquility to equality. The white liberal must see that the Negro needs not only love, but justice. It is not enough to say, "We love Negroes, we have many Negro friends." They must demand justice for Negroes. Love that does not satisfy justice is no love at all. It is merely a sentimental affection, little more than what one would love for a pet. Love at its best is justice concretized. Love is unconditional. It is not conditional upon one saying in this place or watering down his demands in order to be considered respectable. The white liberal must rid himself of the notion that there can be a tensionless transition from the old order of injustice to the new order of justice. The Negro has not gained a single right in America without persistent pressure and agitation. And to hone this point even closer, Richard Nixon had a lot to do with the formation of the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Act. And Bill Clinton, he plays don't ask, don't tell into law. So this idea that Democrats and Republicans have inherent differences should be expunged from people's vocabularies. I absolutely agree that there's liberal and conservative. And even conservative, what does that mean? Because there's little factions of liberalism, there's factions of conservatism. But the more you see, the closer you look, they, in many cases, are aligned with one another. To both of these ancestors' points, we bring you the omitted passage from the so-beloved Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner himself, drafted a set of words condemning the institution of slavery, and after great debate, it was removed, so as to not create controversy and alienate either of the 13 colonies or the slaveholding states from supporting the so-called Revolutionary War, which is what? The first Brexit. Jefferson drafted this as a critique to Britain's King George, while again, he himself was a slave owner. Of course, African people, as usual, were a pawn in the game of warring European sides. In this war, Africans would be declared free by the British if they fought on the side of the Brits. Jefferson, of course, was livid, and with that, somehow saw the light of day that, slavery was a bad thing. Jefferson wrote, quote, "He has waged cruel war against human nature himself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, this opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people to rise in arms among us, and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges to commit against the lives of another. The Declaration of Independence is the documented foundation of the conflict-averse liberalism that both MLK and Malcolm X discussed. And let's discuss this Constitution for a bit. A Constitution that had direct inspiration from the Iroquois Confederacy. The First Amendment to this beloved Constitution says, quote, "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances." The ever-beloved Constitution is clearly not adhered to by police who tear gas, hose, stomp on, and murder people who petition the government. It's not even adhered to by congresspeople such as Lauren Boebert, who says, quote, "The reason we have so many overreaching regulations in our nation is because the church complied. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. That is not how our founding fathers intended it. And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does." End quote. What does slave owner Thomas Jefferson say on January 1st, 1802 to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut? This is what he says. "Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legitimate powers of government reach actions only and not opinions. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should, quote, make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, end quote, thus building a wall of separation between church and state, another, end quote." What does James Madison, the main face of the Constitution, have to say about this? Quote, "The Constitution of the U.S. forbids everything like an establishment of a national religion. The law appointing chaplains establishes a religious worship for the national representatives to be performed by ministers of religion, elected by a majority of them, and these are to be paid out of the national taxes." End quote. Article 11 of the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, signed at Tripoli, November 4th, 1796, states, quote, "As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen, and as the said states never have entered into any war or act of hostility against Mahometan nations, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries." I am quoting all of these things because it's clear the U.S. not only represents conflict-averse liberalism, but is also evocative of the role of a gaslighting abuser. You are coerced to believe the intent of the words are good, yet rationalize the opposite actions as love. You say, "This country has the capacity to do better. I know it does." Any challenge to this notion, one is seen as disruptive to the process. Religious values are highly linked with capitalism in this country and the West in general. Despite what the beloved Constitution says, Eurocentric Judeo-Christian values guide policy consistently, whether it's through chattel slavery, boarding schools, buggery laws, or decisions on whether or not one is able to terminate a pregnancy without being declared a felon. The majority of people affected by these laws are consistently colonized or non-Europeans. And as we know, there was no peace and friendship upon Tripoli in 2011 when the U.S. collaborated with NATO in the complete destruction of Libya, a place that has yet to stabilize itself in the way it was prior to the imperialist attack upon it. On another note, people who singularly criticize people like Boebert do it in a way perpetuating misogyny, class privilege, since Boebert received a GED, Islamophobia, and even covert queer antagonism by trying to out advocates of fascism, such as Nick Fuentes, who praises the so-called Supreme Court decision as, quote, having something like Taliban rule in America in a good way, end quote, as opposed to critiquing the capitalist system, which produced and endorsed the likes of Boebert and Fuentes. Never mind that the U.S. openly funds fundamental religious groups around the world as a mission to displace democratically elected governments. And never mind that all Abrahamic faiths, that is Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, do permit the termination of a pregnancy in specific cases. In Islam, between 40 and 120 days, if pregnancy is a threat to the fetus or carrier's life, or in the case of rape, abortion is permissible. In Judaism, there are similar laws regarding threats to life or rape. In Euro-based Christianity and Catholicism, St. Augustine said, quote, the law does not provide that the act pertains to homicide, for there cannot yet be said to be a live soul in a body that lacks sensation, end quote. There's also the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion, or the CCS, who recognize the racial and class disparities between those who had the funds and connections to receive therapeutic abortions and those who did not. In 1967, a network of 21 ministers and rabbis organized and made referrals for safe and legal access for those who were in the margins. In 1970, abortion became legal in New York City, and the CCS opened a clinic called Women's Services. Having an anti-dialectical framework regarding religion is ahistorical and reactionary. Framing this conversation from the perspective of pro-choice and pro-life is also reactionary because, again, it minimizes the connection capitalism has in shaping the discussion. If you are not actively and openly anti-imperialist, you are neither pro-life or pro-choice. If you are not actively and openly anti-capitalist, you are neither pro-life or pro-choice. If you don't advocate for the masses to have self-determination, if you remain silent in the face of the police murdering Africans, indigenous, or poor folks, if you accept the notion of wage slavery as being inevitable, and if you refuse to see the connection between Western imperialism around the world contributing to global death daily, you are neither pro-life or pro-choice. The U.S. can never be repaired. This country has been a patriarchal white supremacist project from its inception. Those who aim for repair will never be angry enough to want to force actual change. The only way change can occur is to actively destroy the foundational ideology which this country stands upon. If you believe a Democrat can be willed to the left, then you truly don't believe you have the capacity to enact true change. If you willingly leave your destiny in the hands of warmongers, there can never be peace. If you believe voting is simply going to alter the fabric of this society when the very fabric is only small enough to cover the backs of the few, then you will be naked for the rest of your days. If you believe your individual actions are going to affect larger structural change, then you need to study history. The so-called Supreme Court decision on Roe v. Wade has people in the streets because it is an issue that either personally affects them or is an issue they are personally invested in. Reproductive injustice has existed long before the 20th century, with the breeding of enslaved Africans in Virginia in the early to mid-1800s. James Marion Sims, the so-called father of modern gynecology, conducted his research onto enslaved Africans without anesthesia. There were mass sterilizations on indigenous women performed by doctors in the 1970s. These are not just issues regarding whether or not an individual has the ability to choose whether or not to bring a, quote, child into the world, end quote. This is not just about controlling women's bodies. Reproductive justice also has direct ties to the relationship to labor and to the relationship to land. This directly affects every single person who is not part of the capitalist class, particularly those who are on the margins of gender, physicality, health status, and more. If access to basic health care is not a reality for those who are already here, if young people are in the foster care system, sometimes further experiencing trauma, if adopting a child is cost prohibitive and fostering a child requires a particular income or living situation, if those made to bear children are forced to leave a job when it's already a struggle to pay rent or mortgage, if those facing abuse have nowhere to turn, if a child who was raped is now forced to be a parent, this decision undoubtedly affects everyone, regardless of whether or not you can produce a child. So as you go and have your cookouts on the 4th of July, remember whose land you stand upon. Remember the history of the foundation of this country. Remember your silence. Remember your rationalizations. Or remember your resistance to the foundation, which lay beneath and above this country. Ask yourself what you're going to do as you have your cookout. Ask yourself, are you an accomplice? Ask yourself, are you a resistor? And ask yourself and those around you, if I see there's a problem, what am I going to do about it? And what are you going to do about it? And you know what we always say, join an organization, because that is one of the greatest things you can do. If you are upset at the problem, don't just be upset. Don't stand and mobilize and then go to your house and say, I did something. Because that is one singular event. And there are many singular events, but you can connect all of those events once you begin to organize and you begin to make those connections. And the solutions to the problem don't seem so far away once you begin to organize. So once again, join an organization working for justice. Join an organization in which you can actually see a future where the people will be liberated, because it will happen, I assure you. And if you are interested in this particular type of content, we have other comrades in the A-APRP who are doing this type of work as well. We have the weekly Pan-African News. We have our Ancestors' Voices. We have the Revolutionary African Women and the Forward Ever podcast. If you are out for some reason, I don't know why you would be, but having a cookout, celebrating the 4th of July, why would you celebrate the history of this country, right? Hopefully you learned something today. But in case you happen to find yourself at a cookout where someone else is honoring the 4th of July, you can show them the work you do visually by going to the Forward Ever shop and getting a shirt or a hoodie. And hopefully you're not just wearing how you feel about things, you are showing how you feel about things by joining an organization. Because once you join an organization, you understand how much organization decides everything. Organization decides your, my, and everyone's destiny. Forward ever, backwards never.